Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Elizabeth Wahle, University of Illinois Extension. I'm a hort educator in the St. Louis Metro East, so I represent the Madison, Monroe, St. Clair unit. And tonight we're going to talk about daylilies, the plant that's perfect for your garden and also for collecting. I think as we move through the night, you're going to find that there's a grand variety in this plant selection, and hopefully will turn you in as an admirer throughout the evening as well. For those of you who are advancing the slides manually, if you'll go ahead and move from the title slide that has my picture to the next, we should all be on the same page at this stage of the game. So when we look at the classification of daylilies, so let's look at this first. You know, in not too many years ago, this used to be classified in the Liliaceae family. So it was actually related to the Asiatic lilies and tiger lilies, things like that. But with DNA studies, they've actually put it in its own family. This is pronounced Xantheraceae, a little bit easier to pronounce than the spelling looks. This is the common name is the grass or the grass tree family. And as I say, it used to be in the Liliaceae, and with our DNA testing, the Liliaceae kind of tended to be one of those catch-all families where they really couldn't, you know, put it in any other group, but they were similar enough that they put them. And now there are a lot of plant families that have been divided out further differently. So within daylily, they also are in the subfamily of Hemerocallidaceae, and the genus is Hemera Palace, and we'll talk about the genus of where that comes from. And within Hemera Palace, there are 18 recognized species and 2 hybrids. If you go ahead and move to the next slide. So when we look at the name Hemera Palace, this comes from the Greek words of hemera, which means day, and kalos, which means beautiful. So the flowers are beautiful for one day. Now when you're looking at the flowers, usually we talk about something like an iris. I don't know how many times I've had people tell me that they just think irises are absolutely beautiful, but one of the things they don't like about them is that they don't last long enough. Well, daylilies are just as short-lived, but the difference is there are so many flowers that as one disappears after a day, there are several more inflorescence that open up. So their bloom lasts a little bit longer just because there are so many blooms within on the flower stalk. So typically, each flower lasts no longer than 24 hours. It might be give or take a few hours more or less, but in general, it's about 24 hours. Most of the species will open in the early morning and usually wither by the following night. Now there are some that will be replaced the following day by another one. So if you're not really paying close attention, it just seems like it has continuous bloom until they're all done on there. And I might mention that some of these are night bloomers, meaning they open at night and they're still open throughout the day. So those of you who are trying to design night gardens, there are some of these cultivars that would be appropriate for an evening garden, particularly if you're looking for those that are lit. Some of these have scents in them, they smell good, and so these would be, again, an appropriate garden for one of those evening or a romantic type of garden. If you'll move to the next page, this is kind of one of my fun slides on here. All of us have heard of ditch lilies. Maybe we call them something else, you know, like the tiger daylily or the orange daylily or the tawny daylily. But it's kind of interesting because these are so widespread across the nation in our landscapes, we have a tendency to think of them as native. But they're in fact not native, and they're rather invasive. But we love them so much that we're still trading them. And I can go to, you know, little plant sales and they actually sell these. And so this is a very popular plant that pretty much you can collect it anywhere and grow in your yard. So most of us are very, very familiar with daylilies, and this is usually the very first daylily that we experience in our life. So if you will move to the next slide. When we look at a daylily, let's discuss its actual growing parts. And like all plants, this has roots. But what's different about these, within the different cultivars, they don't all have the same roots. Some of them can have a very fibrous, or some of them can have more of a tuberous or storage structures within the roots, and some of them actually produce rhizomes. So I was recently at a plant sale at Missouri Botanical, and that's where you can really see this, when you have a whole gob of daylilies laying out on a table. As you walk along, you can see differences in the root structures, with some of them being, as I say, very fibrous, and others have a very thickened type of root system. These do have a crown in which the stalk and the leaves come out of it. The basic arrangement of the leaf is what we call as vesticus. So if you're looking for some new horticultural terms, this usually means that the leaves are arranged opposite of each other in vertical rows on the opposite side of the crown. So they make somewhat of a fan structure around the main stem. When you look at the leaves, they almost are somewhat folded looking, and they have a really prominent rib in the middle that somewhat looks like the keel of a boat. So if you think about how the bottom of the boat, and there's that main rib at the bottom, that's pretty much how daylilies are. If you move to the next slide, daylilies have different types as well, and I've somewhat showed pictures of each one of them running down the right side of the slide. So starting at the top, there are, well, I guess I don't have them in order, sorry. If you look at the top one, this would be a double. This means that instead of just a single set of petals and sepals, it has two sets. And then the picture down, the pink flower is a single bloom. This is the standard trumpet. The third one down is what we would describe as a polytepal. Now, if you're familiar with daylilies, usually their flower parts are in threes, and they usually have 3 petals in the forefront and 3 sepals that look like petals in the background. But if you look at that third picture down, can you tell me how many petals you count? If you count, you'll see that it's 4. And the normal arrangement is always divisible by 3. So this is something different, and so they give it a different name. So when you're looking in a catalog and you see polytepal, you immediately know that it doesn't have a number of petals divisible by 3. It has a different arrangement. And in this particular case, this one has 4. There are also a category called small or miniature, and you can see holding a quarter up to the flower, and they're very small flowers, smaller than what you usually think about in daylilies. If you page down to the next slide, the flowers actually have an overall structure as well. And so when you look at them, or I should say a shape, so when you look at the flowers where they're in bloom, they have somewhat of a structure. So there are circular flowers that they have an overall round appearance. So if you think an example of another round flower would be something like a zinnia. In general, those flowers are round. There are triangular flowers. So when you look at them, the sepals are generally very recurved so that you cannot see the background. So all you're seeing are the 3 petals. And because you're seeing 3 petals, it looks triangular. There are star segments that tend to be long and pointed. And I'll be showing you some pictures as we go along on some of these, and you'll start picking them out. An informal means that it really doesn't have a definite shape. It's just kind of out there. No structural shape. Flat ones are, they just really, none of the petals are recurved. It just has a flat shape to it. Compare that to recurved, where the petals actually fold back on themselves or they're tucked under. And the one that we know the best is the trumpet, and that's the one that looks like a true lily. So I think when we go into this, if you really haven't paid attention, you walk along, you look at daylilies, you know it's a daylily, but until you truly look at the flower, you don't start noticing these little details to the bloom. So if we'll page down, let's start looking at some of these different forms and different color markings on the blossoms themselves. So when we look at what is called a spider, for those of you, some of you may be members of the American Hemera Palace Society, that's the Daylily Society. They're the ones that debate what constitutes a spider. And the current definition right now is that the petal length is 4 times the petal width or more. So if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you see an example of a spider. So look at the yellow flower in the lower left-hand corner. You can see that the petals are very long and narrow, and that constitutes a spider. If we move to the second description, which is crispate, this may contain pinched segments, twisting segments, or quilling on one or more segments. And so quilling means that the petal is actually rolled and connected so that it looks like the quill of a pen. An example of that is the third picture over. And you can see that it looks like if you took your forefinger and your thumb and pressed together on the petal, it actually has a pinched area in it. And this is called crispate, when the petals have this pinched area in it. When you describe petals as being spatulate, that means that they have a very wide end to it. Instead of having a narrow tip, they're wide. And if you look at the second picture from the left, you can see that those petals have very blunt ends. They're not pointed and slender like the others, so this would be considered spatulate. When you describe a bloom as cascade, this means that they are like a waterfall is the best way that I could describe it. They just kind of come out and fall down. They're not necessarily super recurved, but they usually just kind of have that cascading look. So cascade is a description to some of the blooms. Now the reason that we're going through this is when you're going through catalogs, they use all of these words to describe the flowers. And they don't always show a picture in the catalog, so they rely on you understanding what these terms mean and that you actually build a picture in your head by understanding what these terms mean. And so let's move down to the next slide and start looking at the flower structure so that you understand how the plant is put together, and then we'll talk about some of the color points on the different blooms. Now, terminology, when you're looking in the catalog, they'll tell you how tall the scape is. And the scape is actually the stalk that the blooms are born on. And they can be very short, holding the flowers close to the leaves, or they can be very tall and hold the flowers well above the leaves. And when you're using daylilies in your landscape for design, that is an important feature. You know, and whether you want that airy nature, you know, that means you would be looking for one that holds those flowers well above the leaf structures. And others, maybe you want a much smaller plant and you want those blossoms held close to the plant. You don't want it to be using all of that headspace. So the scape, again, is the actual flower stalk in which the flowers develop. Now here's where I've been talking about petals and sepals, and here you can see the difference. So the petals are the 3 petals that are foremost or closest to you. The sepals are the set of 3 that are behind. The sepals do not have to be the same color as the petals, and they also do not need to be marked the same as the petals. Sometimes all are different. The pistil is the female structure, and there's usually 1 per flower. The stamen is the male structure. This is where the filament and the anther is held, where the pollen is created. And there are normally 6 per flower. I usually think of this as there are 2 per petal when we're talking about stamen. So when you have one of those polytepal type of blooms and there are 4 petals, you usually have then 8 stamens on that type of flower. So I always think 2 per petal is what is normal. But there's usually only 1 pistil. Sometimes we'll see a double ovary on it, but usually there's 1. If you look at a characteristic that is very desirable, it is reblooming. Sometimes they do this 2 different ways. The subsequent appearance of more than one scape on the same plant. That means instead of sending up one stalk, they send up multiple ones from reblooming. And usually that second stalk is never as florivorous as the original. So it's usually not as strong. And this is one of the ways to extend bloom. So whenever you're looking in a catalog and you see reblooming, it usually can rebloom one of two ways. And as I say here, there can be a period with no bloom in between. So there's a distinct interval, like it blooms, and then all you have is leaves for a while, and then it sends up a flower stalk again, and you get a second bloom. Then there are others that there really isn't a period between. You just get a second stalk, like I described up above. So they kind of do it in two different ways. And again, that's in, kind of looking up, doing a little research on the cultivar to understand how they're going to behave. If you move to the next slide. Now, talking beyond how pretty the flower is, I mean, that's usually what really gets our attention is how beautiful the flowers are. If you go to a plant sale where they're selling them, that's really what you're looking at is the bloom or a picture of a bloom. That's what you're basing your characteristics on. But there are other things that you really need to think about on these. Branching is one of those. The more branching you have, the more surface you have for bloom. And so branch number, the higher the number, the better. Bud count, these are actually how many blooms you have. So when they say bud count, that's how many flowers you're going to get on each one. So if you have increased branching, you're probably going to have increased bud count. You also want to think about attractive foliage. So go ahead and read the descriptors. You want to make sure that they say things like disease-free foliage. That usually means that they have a higher resistance to some of the common diseases that we have. It's not a guarantee, but you need to think about this year has been a perfect year for us to develop things like streak on daylilies. Very common. I've seen a lot of really ugly looking daylilies this year just because it's been wet, humid, perfect conditions for its development. And so you really want to look at daylilies that have some resistance to these so that you have year-long attractiveness on the foliage. I've already mentioned reblooming. Again, usually it's a big plus to have a rebloomer. And also I've mentioned scapes on how tall the scapes are. So all of that information is usually included with a description of a daylily. If you move to the next slide, let's talk about, oops, Sarah. Sorry guys, I went the wrong way. You did it right and I did it wrong. When we talk about plant habit, I want to say that one of the descriptors that you're going to see on daylilies is whether they, what they do over the winter months. Do they go dormant? Do they stay evergreen? Or are they somewhere in between? And really this is a trait or characteristic that is determined by the breeder. And it might not be the same in your growing area. So for example, if this daylily was developed south of where you live, there's a possibility that it may be semi-evergreen where that breeder is. But if you live north of them, it might actually go dormant. So don't always rely on that as an absolute. If you really get into daylilies and kind of find out where they were bred and where they were released from, maybe you can make some guesses. But usually there's somewhat of a continuum. If you come into my yard where I have quite a few daylilies, and I know we have some listeners that have quite a few daylilies, you kind of notice that it's across the board. There are some that go completely dormant, they die back and they disappear and you do not see them again until spring when they start to germinate. Then there are some that they stay green and nice the whole winter long. They don't seem to die back. They manage to stay evergreen throughout the year. And then there are those that are that in between and they just look ugly. They look like they've been frost burned. They don't completely go dormant, but they're not nice and lush and green. And those are the semi-evergreen ones. Now this past winter, when it was so incredibly cold, I had some that are normally semi-evergreen go completely dormant. It got cold enough that it made them go completely dormant. So you will see some differences. Now in the picture here, I have an example of one that's rated semi-evergreen, Byzantine Emperor. And this is when early spring, and that's one of the nice things about these semi-evergreen ones or evergreens. Man, they are quick to green up in the spring. Very fast recovery. So something like this cultivar is way ahead of one that would be completely dormant because it's got to do the whole emergence things from the ground. So if we go down, move to the next slide. If you look at color patterns, this is where I think it's so fascinating to look at daylily blooms. And again, a lot of us just walk by and recognize daylilies, but the collectors, this is what they're so interested in, are these color patterns and the beauty that these plant breeders are producing. So if we follow the pictures on the right-hand side from the top and work our way down, I'm going to describe some of these color descriptors. And again, you know, when you're reading a description on a daylily, using this information, you can kind of start putting together in your mind what it should look like. So a self means that all of the flower segments are the same color. So the petals in the foreground and the sepals in the back are all the same color. So you look at the top picture, you can see the entire flower is yellow. When you have a blend, that means a blend of two or more colors. So they are actually somewhat of a blending of the two. And you see that this one is somewhat of a yellow and it blends into a little bit of a mauve pink, the second picture down. When you go into a polychrome, that means it's a blend of more than two colors. So the third picture down looks like that it's a blend of pink, some yellow, and maybe some white colors. So it looks like it's more than two colors blended together. When you have a bitone, the petals and sepals differ in shade or intensity of the same basic color. So in the fourth picture down, you see that the petals are a bright cherry red pink, and the sepals are a nice light pink color. A reverse bitone is the exact opposite. So instead of the petals being dark, it's the sepals that are dark, and the petals are light. So in that lower picture, you can see that it's somewhat of a pinkish yellow color, very dark on the sepals, but the petals are a very light color, almost yellow. And when we look at a bicolor, that means two distinctly different colors. And so you can see that the petals are almost an ox blood red, and then the sepals are a yellow color. So they're two distinct colors. So, you know, after you've looked at these, you think, wow, these really do have quite a bit of difference in there. So let's go ahead to the next slide and look at a few more of these. When we look at color patterns, there's also called an eye on there. And you can see that on the top picture, it's almost like that it has an iris on there. So there's an orange flower and it has a very deep orange eye that is marked on each one of the petals. Now this is sometimes when you see an eye, it is not always on the sepal. And so on this one, the eyed ones are on both sepals and petals. We call it banded when that eye is only on the petals. Okay? So it's eyed when it's on all flower parts and called banded when it is only on the petals. A halo is a very faint or only slightly visible eye. It is a very light or slightly visible eye. A watermark, though, in comparison, is like a very complex, multi-layered, multicolored sometimes eye on the flower. So if you look at the fourth one down, that's an example of a watermark. And when you look at a flower that is edged or picoteed, you can look at that last flower at the very bottom, and you can see that it has a beautiful ribbon of purple marking the edge of every one of the petals and sepals. So that bottom one not only is edged, but it also has an eyed marking on it as well. So some of these are used in combination to describe the flowers. It's not just one description. Sometimes it can have several of these descriptors to describe it. You'll move to the next slide. We also have what is called tipping. If you look at the top picture, if you look at the sepals, you'll notice each one of them is tipped in white. Something maybe that you wouldn't notice if you weren't really paying close attention, but again, this is one of the descriptors for this. So if I were describing this, I would say that this is a blood red, green-throated daylily with tipped in white sepals, so that you should be able to somewhat build a picture in your mind just from my descriptors. When we call dusted, this is my way of saying, if you thought of taking a paintbrush with paint and you kind of flecked it at the flower, that was what we would be calling dusted, dotted, flecked, flaked, speckled, or stippled. So depending on, what terminology the breeder uses, that usually means that it's got some sort of stippling of color throughout. And so you look at this second one down, this is what, if we were looking at an iris, we would call a broken pattern. But when we're talking about daylilies, they call it dusting. If you look at the third picture down, this is what we would call a midrib. That means that the midrib in the petals and the sepals has a different color. And in this particular case, it's white. And so that you can distinctly see where the center line is on each one of the petals. This last one's a little bit more difficult for me to describe, and not all flowers have them, but when they do, when a flower is dusted, it looks like sugar. It sparkles in the light. When you turn the flower and let light hit it, it just looks like it has diamond dust on it. It just really looks like it's made out of sugar. So again, if you see the word diamond dusting, you immediately know that that has that real sparkly quality to the texture of the flower. If you move to the next slide, let's talk about some of the growing and caring for daylilies. I'm going to say that if you're selecting the best place to grow them, would be in medium to heavy loam. We don't usually say that. We usually talk about, lighter soils, but they grow best in heavy to medium loam. And when you plant them, you don't fertilize this right away. A lot of plants that we plant, we kind of sprinkle fertilizer around these. You usually wait a little bit. Usually it's the following spring when you can do a light application. Now, I'll change that a little bit. If you're growing on some sand, you probably need to fertilize a little bit more. Most of us, though, are growing on loams to clay loams, so we can usually have sufficient fertility when they're first planted. These grow best in full sun. So the question should be, well, what if you don't have a space that's in full sun? What's the consequences? Well, the consequences is you're not going to have as good a flower display. They will still grow, but you probably won't have as good a flower display if you don't have full sun on there. I will say these can be divided anytime in reality, but they're really best divided in late summer. And I'm going to say statewide, that's probably going to be between August 15 and September 30 to be able to dig them up and divide them. When we talk about dividing plants, there's a couple of different ways you can approach this, and it's really up to you what you want to do. One way is a little bit tougher than others. If you look at the pictures, the top picture is the whole entire clump has been dug up, and I used 2 forks, and I stuck them back to back and then pulled them apart, and I separated that clump into 2 clumps, and I just planted the 2 new clumps. So effectively, I reduced the size of the clump, but I now have 2 plantings instead of 1. Now, one of the other ways you can do is actually separate that clump down to individual plants, and that's a lot more work to do that. But also, you can plant them around a lot more and have a much bigger planting, or have a lot of plants to share with family or friends, neighbors, and so forth. So really, you can do it either way. Now, one of the things that if you divide it, just divide a clump into 2 or 3 pieces, you'll probably have a much more dramatic flower display after dividing than if you do it as individual plants. So again, it's really what you're shooting for. When you dig these, they should be trimmed back to about 8 to 10 inches of foliage before you plant them. So don't leave the foliage full length. They should be cut back. If you move to the next slide, one thing that I'm going to mention, and this plant is not that common in the nursery trade. I have seen it. I see it more often in mail order. I have seen it when I've gone up to nurseries up in places like Michigan, Wisconsin. So it is there. So the plant I'm talking about is Petrinia scavicifolia, and this is known probably most commonly as golden valerian, and this is an alternate host for Daylily Rust. And so for those of you who want to grow daylilies, this is not a plant to be planting in your yard because you open yourself up to creating a disease cycle that will cause disease to develop on your daylilies. And if you look at the lower picture that's showing a leaf blade of a daylily, you can see that this is a fungal disease. And when you see rust, it usually looks like rust. It gets its name because if you see rust on your car, it has that orangey look to it. And most rusts do on plants as well. It does require 2 hosts to complete its life cycle. So one of them is the golden valerian and the other one is the daylily in which the rust shows up. So our most effective method of not having this is not having the plant planted in your yard. Now, if you do have the plant or your neighbor has the plant and you end up with rust, there are fungicide options if removing the plant is not an option. So I'll just leave it at that. The main thing is, even though this is an absolutely beautiful plant, golden valerian is a beautiful plant, it is not a good match for daylilies. We go down a slide, see a little bit closer picture of Daylily Rust. Now, I will mention that cultivars do vary in susceptibility, so if you're a daylily grower and you've had a problem with this, one of the unfortunate things about this is once you get it started, it does not require the golden valerian to always be there. Once it gets started, it's capable of the cycle continuing at that point. And so if you've had daylily rust in the area, as I say, there are fungicide options, but you also have the option of having some resistant cultivars. So they do have resistant, and I've listed just a few here so that you can see pictures of them running down the side and also the name. So if you have copy notes on this, you can see some examples of resistant cultivars to the Daylily Rust. So if we go to the next page, these are the summary of Daylily Rust control. Number 1, row-resistant cultivars, particularly if you've had a problem. Sanitation is very important. Make sure that you remove and destroy all infected plants and purchase disease-free plants. Usually if you're buying from a reputable nursery, they're not going to sell you rust-infected plants. And you want to minimize splashing. You know, a lot of times when we talk about disease control in the garden, we talk about minimizing splashing. And this is another one. And one of the ways is to reduce overhead watering. Make sure that you have good plant spacing so there's not a lot of humidity buildup around, because those are good conditions for rust developing. So those are just, and as I say, one of the other options is, as a final option, would be fungicide sprays. We go to the next slide. Now, this is probably what most of you are familiar with. This year we had very good conditions for this. This is called Daylily Streak, and again, this is another fungal infection. Usually we see this as a central vein yellowing. You see this streak running down the middle, and then the leaf just starts getting necrotic from the tip down. And when you're working with this, it will actually move into the stalk as well, and sometimes it can cause reddish-brown flecks and all along the infected foliage. And so you can see several pictures here that are pretty indicative of Daylily Streak. And again, this is one of the susceptibility does vary among daylily cultivars, but none in this case are known to be truly resistant. So there are some that you'll see don't look as bad, but if conditions are good, they themselves can also get streak as well if you have bad infection running in your plantings. If you move to the next slide, if we look about some controls, again, it's always best to buy from a reputable grower. You know, I say that with tongue-in-cheek because I'm quite an avid collector, and I collect from, you know, friends and family all the time. And, you know, there's always the possibility that you're bringing something from someone else's yard into your yard. I just want to put it in the back of your mind that, you know, you always want to look for the cleanest plant material that you possibly can into your yard. This is primarily spread by water splashing again. So anything that you can do to keep that water splashing down helps to control this. This is a disease that develops when temperatures are above 90 degrees. So the hotter the year, the more we have streak. Also, when it's wet and when you put the two together, it's a bad year for streak. If you have issues, again, fungicide control is an option. I usually recommend that as you see leaves that have been infected and are necrotic and dying, that you remove those so that, again, water's not splashing on them and then splashing on clean material. Move to the next slide. For those of you who don't have daylilies yet, I feel like I should mention that some of them are very tasty. I had a funny story I was just on our main campus in Champaign, and one of the instructors there was telling a funny story about a community garden that had daylilies. And the gardeners couldn't figure out why the daylilies never bloomed. And it turned out that there was several families that liked daylilies. They liked to pick the unopened blooms and put them in tempura batter, deep fry them, and eat them. So the reason the plant wasn't blooming was someone was eating them. Well, in this case, I want to say that deer absolutely love daylilies as well, some more than others. And so this is my little comedy slide again, and you can, if you look closely, I've given the deer vampire teeth. And so they can really do a number on some of your daylilies in the early spring when they're up in your yard looking for fresh, tender shoots coming out. So sometimes you'll start noticing which of your daylilies you need to protect because they seem to go to them year after year after year. So if we go to the next slide, you know, I've kind of given you all these beautiful descriptions of daylilies and tried to get you excited about collecting these. Now I'm going to give you the numbers. I checked in 2013 with the American Hemera Palace Society, Daylily Society, and they have in their registry over 74,000 cultivars. So there's lots to choose from. And as I say, within those, there are all sorts of foliage classifications from evergreen to dormant over winter, from early to late season bloom. Now I'm going to say statewide in Illinois, the majority of the bloom is going to be in July and August. That'll be the majority of the bloom. There are dwarf to tall cultivars and repeat bloomers. So that's kind of a summary of everything that we've talked about. So you keep in your mind more than 74,000 to choose from. So what I'm telling you, don't get too set on one because there are lots more that are just as beautiful to collect. So if we move to the next one, that moves to, well, with 74,000 to choose from, how do you get started? And my recommendation is to start with the Stout medal winners. This is the highest award given by the Hemera Palace Society. It's given in memory of Dr. Arlo Burdett Stout. He's considered the father of modern-day breeding in North America of daylilies. And it's an annual award given to the most outstanding daylily. And so this is something that Daylily cannot win the Stout Medal Award until it's already won the Award of Merit from the Society. So it already has to be outstanding before it even qualifies to be a Stout Medal winner. And so you can get on the internet or contact the Daylily Society and get a list of what these Stout Medal winners are. And I can guarantee you that by and large, every one of these is a superior lily and will be a nice addition to your planting. And so here I have the 2013 Stout Medal winner, and this is Heavenly Angel Ice. And you can see that it has that beautiful rippled margin. And if you look closely, you can see it's edged in white. So it's a yellow, a very light green-throated spider with a nice ribbon edge of white on it. So it's quite lovely. Go to the next page. I'm going to show you now some pictures that how they differ and how some of them are so similar they have all the same description but they look completely different. So this is the first one I'm going to start. Stella Dork. This is probably one of the most common daylilies you're going to see in the nursery because this is one tough daylily. You can put this in one of the hottest, roughest sites in your garden and it will do well. And so this is won the Stout Medal winner in 1985. And so you'll notice that the scapes are only 11 inches, so you can immediately start visualizing that this is a fairly small plant. The bloom size is only 2 3/4 inches, so again, the flowers are relatively small. So you should be able to start building a picture in your head of what this looks like. This is a type that completely dies back in the winter. It does have a fragrance to it, and by bloom habit, it has extended, so you can assume that it has multiple scapes coming up on this. So this is, you've learned all the terminology, so this is described as a gold self with a very small green throat. So you've learned to understand all of these descriptors and you should be able to picture it in your mind without even seeing the picture. So now you see the picture and you're like, yes, I've got it unpacked. So let's go to another, and I'm not going to go in all the details, you can just kind of look at these. This is El Desperado, and you can see that this is one that has an eye zone on it, and it also has a picoteed edge on it, and this is yellow or red on yellow there. So this is considered a mustard yellow with wine purple eye zone above a green throat. A lot of daylilies have a green throat. That'll be a common theme that you'll hear through this is a green throat on a lot of these. If you move down a slide, this is one of my more favorite ones. This is one of the older ones. It was released in 1970. This is Green Tarantella. This is a tall one, 36 inches. And the blooms, look at that, 7.5 inches. That's about, most women's hands are around that size. So, women, hold up your hands so the guys can see, and you can tell about how big that flower is. That's a pretty good sized flower on this. And this is described as a soft yellow self with a green throat. Again, the edges of the petals have a nice ripple to them, and it's just an overall lovely, lovely flower. And on this one, you'll notice that this is a semi-evergreen one. So this is one that kind of, in the semi-cold areas, kind of looks ratty in the winter time, but it'll get going pretty soon. Has fragrance, and this is one that the blooms open at night. Okay, so it's a night bloomer. Now you should recognize that eaten up plant. This belongs to Bananas Plus. So this is one that tastes good to the deer in my yard. Every year they eat this plant, so I came to the conclusion that it must taste good, so I tasted the flowers. I didn't taste the foliage, but the flower does have a nice kind of a lemony flavor to it, so it does have somewhat of a nice flavor. And you notice that it is considered very fragrant, and it is. It has a very nice fragrance with it. This is one that's 32 inches, and again, the flowers are fairly decent size, 6 inches. We look at the next slide. You should be on slide 30 for angel cups. This is 30 inches, and this is an example of a double. This is considered an ivory self with yellow-green throat. I will mention that probably one of the colors that you don't see as often is a white in daylilies. It's just not that common to see it. A lot of the pinks, yellows, blood reds, those are the real, and oranges. See those colors. You just don't see a whole lot of true white in this category. If you go down to the next slide, Condilla, a 77 release. This is again one of the smaller ones, 20 inches tall, 4.5 inches. So at this point you should be seeing that there are all different sizes of blooms to fit your needs, all different colors. So this is considered a deep gold self. And this is one where the foliage goes completely dormant in the winter time. You go down, Lime Frost is one that, you know, because I've seen so many daylilies, this is one that jumps out at me because it is very close to white, and it just seems unusual to see a daylily that's this light colored. It is 27 inches, 5 3/4 inches, so it's probably about average in sight, but it's considered a green and white blend with a green throat, and just absolutely a lovely, lovely daylily. If we go to Northern Giant, you should assume by the name that it's giant, but you look at this, this is one that's not that tall in terms of the scapes. So this is an example of where the flowers are held fairly close to the foliage. They're not airy and floating well above. So this is one that has relatively large blooms, but held much closer to the foliage. This is described as ribbon pink with a gold edge above a green throat. You move to the next slide. I want to say that this is probably what I'm seeing more of a change in the breeding. You see this just beautifully ruffled edge on the petals and on the sepals as well. A lot of the new releases are really frilled and sugary looking. This is one that has that sugary diamond dusting on it. Again, 28 inches, 5.5 inches. That's probably average size on those. Considered a cream pink blend with a gold edge on it. So the edging is very ribbon frilled like. If you go to the next slide, which is Christina Cook, again 18 inches, 2 3/4 inch flowers. This is a very early one, and you notice this is a rebloomer. So again, just kind of giving you examples of the different sizes, the different characteristics of these as we move through. If you go to the next one, now this is where I want you to start paying attention to the color description. I'm going to show you a whole series that are described as red black self with a green throat. And this is the first one, and I got to this point and I said, and the last one today, and I left it there because I got started and I thought, oh, but I have so many more to show you. So I'll show you a few bit more, but I want you to pay attention to Ed Murray. This is a Stout Medal Award winner from 1981. As I said, it's described as a red-black self with a green throat, so kind of look at that one. It almost has, you know, that mid-rib marking on it. It has a very faint mid-rib marking, very distinct green throat on that. So let's go down a page and look at this description. Red-black self with yellow-green throat. Exact same description, but it doesn't quite look like the one that we just saw. It's smaller across the board. So again, when you're reading these descriptions, when you're ordering, kind of keep in your mind that it might be on the light end of black red self, and then there's a really dark end of black red self. So it's not, I took all of these pictures, so these are pretty color representative of how a breeder describes it is not like another breeder would describe it. So let's go to this one. This one, instead of a black red self, is described as a blood red self with a lime green throat. And this is Top Gun's Riri. This is again 24 inches, very similar, a little bit larger flower than the previous one that we had, but again a different color of red than the other two. But by the description, they almost seem like they should be the same, but they're not. Look at this one. This is Will Rogers, again a very well-known favorite, and this is called a Cranberry Red Self with green throat. To me, this is Cranberry Red. The previous one was Blood Red. They're actually very similar in color to me, but the breeders didn't use the same name. But this one has a slight white picoted edge on it, but it has a green throat as well. So if you like red, they've been coming out for a number of years, some absolutely beautiful red ones. Page down, her best bloomers. This is just a really beautiful fuchsia red and it has, if you look closely, it does have a red eye zone on the petal. Very faint there, but it is there. It's a darker color, and it has that nice yellow to green throat on there. This is a more recent release. This came out in 2001. 20 inches, 4 inches flower bloom. So this is a really nice average size daylily, very beautiful color. It really pops in the garden because of that fuchsia color. This is one that I particularly like. This is one that has the crispate or, you know, the pinched segments on it, but it also has that complex eye zone on it as well. 28 inches, 5.5 inches. This is one of the later ones, it is just a very beautiful purple color in the garden. You know, a lot of times when we're in gardens, a lot of the red flowers are very, they need a lot of moisture. And for those of us who live in the southern part of the state, red sometimes is a challenge for us. Those in the northern part of the state a lot of times can, you know, grow things like cardinal flower and get away with it. Some of these reds that are in these daylilies are a nice substitution to add red to your garden when we don't have a lot of choices. But this also is a very beautiful purple color. If we go down here, this is Vincent Van Gogh, and you saw this picture earlier when I showed you the example of it having very broad petals on it. This is that spatulate structure that you can see. It's a very tall plant, 36 inches, 6.5 inch size flower. So again, this is like big blooms floating in the air, just lovely. If we go to the next, this is Lilting Lavender, and this is one that again is that unusual form where the petals are all curling and twisting. And kind of an interesting color. It's a very light lavender with a light green throat. The flowers are huge. They're 8 inches and they're held 30 inches above. So this is a very large flower, and it's one of the older ones. It's a 1973 release. So there are a lot of antiques that are still widely traded in the industry, and there are a lot of new ones coming out as well. This is one of the traditional oranges. This is Bold Tiger that has a very distinct eye zone on it. This is one of my more favorite because of the interesting color. They describe this as a Scarlet Self, and it is really a very true orange red. I mean, it's a screaming orange red with a green yellow throat. And so this is again average size, is that 26 inch range, 5.5 inch flowers, but it has a very unusual flower color that really stands out. This is Neon Angel. I throw this in here because Mr. Niswanger is from Illinois. He's an avid breeder in not only daylilies, but daffodils and irises as well. So we have in Illinois one of our own who is adding to the beauty of our world, and this is one of his. This is Neon Angel, and he describes this as a light orange with a red eye above an orange throat. So you notice this one's a little bit different, that it has an orange throat instead of the standard green throat. And this again is kind of an average size daylily, but just very lovely. You know, the pictures that I'm showing you here, I've walked the Missouri Botanical Garden has a beautiful daylily display, and when you're walking along, those that jump out at you is what I have pictured here. So these are some that just really stand out in the background of many, many flowers. This is heartfelt. This is just a beautiful red-orange with a deep orange-red halo on it. It is just really a beautiful orange. You know, in the fall when you see some leaves that don't look real, the color they've turned, that's how I would describe this orange. It does not look real. It's just so bright and vivid, beautiful color. This is Emerald Splendor, just an absolutely lovely light yellow and very delicate. You can see how frilly and light and delicate those petals look on there. So not only do these petals differ in their stiffness, they differ considerably about how much fluting is on them, how much twisting and curling. So they're all very unique and different. Now, these last two, I have two more. I want to show you. This is a parent of the next slide. So this is Nightwings, released in 1985 by Williams. And it's 30 inches tall, 6 inches. So this is Nightwing, and this is called a black red self, again, with the yellow-green throat, just like several of the others that we've seen. Now here, if you go down the next slide, is one of the progeny. So that was you. Frankly came out, and this is 24 inches and 5 inches wide. So a little bit smaller bloom, a little bit smaller plant, but again, has that characteristics of that near black self. So that's the direction they're going with breeding, is trying to find, just like they did in irises, trying to get that black flower. They're moving in that direction with daylilies, trying to get one that is black. So this is my contact information. It should be, if you have copies of the slides, if you have some additional questions beyond what we answer coming up here, feel free to contact me. I'd be glad to answer any questions. And I'm going to, before I open it up to questions, remember those who are the coordinators for each of the offices listening in today, if you'll make sure that you go onto the online evaluation folder and report your attendance numbers, it would be greatly appreciated. So Kari, at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. You can either do it by voice or you can type it in the chat window. Either is acceptable.
Lake County.
Sure, go ahead, Lake County.
What are the names of the fungicides? I've never been able to find one for any of the leaf strike or the rust.
Yeah, the ones that for the rust, you're going to want a different one for the rust if you have that, and probably one of the active ingredients you're going to want to look for is myclobutanil, and probably the most common brand would be Spectracide Immunox would have that. So that would be appropriate for the rust. For the streak, you can use the same compound or a product with chlorthalonil would be appropriate. Now that one's a lot more common in the garden centers or the farm stores. You know, for example, I think Ortho calls theirs garden disease control or something similar to that. So myclobutanil specifically for rust, and for the streak you can use the myclobutanil or the chlorthalonil. I want to point out that chlorthalonil will not work on rust. So that one needs to be the myclobutanil. Okay, we're curious. How many varieties do you have in your garden? Oh gosh, I don't know. I was just joking with one of the master gardeners that's sitting in the room with me. She is, I think, member of the Greater St. Louis Daylily Society, and she said she went home with 20 new ones this year. I went home with 18, so I'm not as bad as her. So I would guess that I'm probably around 100 daylilies. Iris is where my serious weakness is. I'm well over the 700 mark on that one. So that's, what was the beautiful watermark one from slide 15? I'll back up and see if I can remember. I'm not sure if I'll remember, but I'll back up in a minute and look. Can you recommend any places to buy daylilies that would be considered antique? Antique. Do you know anyone that has antique ones, really old ones? We're thinking here between us.
One of the members in the club has all the Stout winners, but
yeah, and you know, if I were doing it myself, a lot of times what I do is I get online and go to the Hemera Palace Society, and they have a lot of the daylily nurseries listed there. And I would start there looking for people that sell old ones. You know, the reality is that a lot of people that sell daylilies don't always keep the old ones in stock because they sell the ones that sell. You know, and a lot of the old ones have stayed in collectors' hands, so it becomes difficult. A lot of times it's an individual that has all those really old ones. So I just start with the Hemera Palace Society. I'm not aware of them having a historical preservation society for daylilies. Do you know of one off the top of your head? Yeah, you might look. I haven't checked. You might check to see if there is a Hemera Palace Historical Daylily Society. They have them for other plants. I just don't know off the top of my head if daylily has one. How big is your property for 700? And how do they breed cross? Okay, on my property I have a yard about probably an acre overall. And as I say, the 700 plus is irises, and I don't keep any spacing between them. And I probably have 100 daylilies. And again, I have kind of a cottage garden, so everything runs together. So that's something that you all can do. You know, if you really love something, you know, a lot of times when we talk about planting things, we always talk about having this really unique space between each plant and giving it its space and things. But you can break those rules if you're looking for a different flow together design. And I have that flow together design on my property. It is really more of a cottage garden feel for that. And I do not keep seed, so I'm not interested in, that's the daylilies or the irises. I don't keep seed from any of those. The wildlife pretty much gets all of that. So when they produce seed head, pretty much the birds, squirrels, raccoons, and possums take care of all that for me. So I don't have any great little new plants developing. I'm going to attempt to back up to slide 17. So if you see your screen rapidly changing, that's what I'm attempting to do rather quickly. And I'm not going to make a guarantee that I'll remember what this is. Oops, there, I pushed it too many times. Let's go forward. I don't remember what that is. Where are you at? And I will look. You are Sarah. Why don't you?
This is Sarah in Chicago.
Sarah, send me an email to remind me, and I will look it up, and I will tell you.
It's absolutely. I mean.
Yeah, I will be glad to do that. I will look it up, and I will send it to you. Send me a reminder email, and I will do that for you.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. Okay. Do we have, I see somebody, do I deadhead my plants? Yes. I'm going to say when I have time, when I'm, you know, have moments, I'm kind of a nut about cleaning up plants so that they look as neat as possible all the time. And also because I have so many plants, that's one of my ways of keeping disease down, is not letting disease material be in the yard. So actually, if we stick to daylilies, as daylilies start getting ugly, I'll walk through the yard, I'll make a pass through, and I'll remove each one of the senescing flowers, and then when all of them are done, I'll remove the stalk or the scape. I leave the leaves to senesce as long as they possibly can. You know, it's kind of the same thought with things like daffodils. Yes, they have a period of looking ugly, but as long as they're green, they're photosynthesizing and sending resources down to that root system or their storage. And so my method is as parts are dying off, I remove it and keep, you know, them looking as nice as I can at the end, but I do not cut them off while they're still green. I let them photosynthesize as long as I possibly can to keep a nice, strong plant. But in answer to your question, yes, I deadhead when I have time to do it. I'm just like any other gardener. I'm gone for periods, and you come to my yard and you think I haven't done anything. And then there are other periods that looks nice and neat, and you know everything's going well. But a lot of times, if we step away from daylilies, deadheading, you know, promotes a plant to bloom again on a lot of different plants. Now, daylilies, you're not going to get that unless it's a rebloomer, but it does neaten the plant up significantly. Okay, can you eat the flowers of all of them? Yes, and some taste better than others. I told the story that there are some cultures that really like daylilies. They, you know, use them in stir fry. Some of them put them in tempura batter and eat them. Some like them better than others. I love the beauty of them so much, I don't eat mine. So, but yes, they are edible.
We have a question. Do you mulch your daylilies, and if so, what do you use?
I'm speaking for myself personally. My entire, all of my planting beds are mulched. I probably mulch every 2 years. The material I use, I don't know exactly what it is. It's not pine bark. I would guess it to be hardwood bark mulch that's coming out of tree trimming services, and my particular one is double screened hardwood bark mulch. So it's not super fine. I would say that it ends up to be probably a medium texture, and I usually lay mulch every 2 or 3 years on there. So it's not volcano mulch, but it's sufficient enough to keep the weeds down on the beds. A lot of people use things like pine bark, pine needles, all of those things. Some people use newspaper around plants and then put something on top. All of those work well for controlling weeds. You know, if you're a gardener like I am, I'd rather spend all of my time planting plants and kind of fooling around with them. One of my lesser favorite things is weeding. So for me, mulch is a way for me to not have to weed quite so much. Okay, do we have any questions here in the room with me? You guys are welcome to ask questions too. I'm gonna.
What's the difference between the diploid and the tetraploid or something like that?
Yeah, we have a question with what is the difference between a diploid and a tetraploid, and without getting into too much detail, the tetraploid is when, you know, they've multiplied the genetic material, and that's what allows them to get into these real complex flower colors and shapes and things. So it's just like irises. They've done the same thing where they've multiplied the ploidy number, and instead of the, you know, beautiful simple flowers, they've really gone into these really crazy colors and you know, the frilliness and the doubling. All this wonderful stuff has come with, you know, genetic manipulation on there. And those are edible too. Okay. That's not like GMOs or, you know, anything there. You know, it's just their
The other
breeding
question
process.
I had is they said if you cut them off after they're done blooming, that it makes them multiply more.
We have a question here, and she says she's read where if you cut them off after blooming that they multiply more. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I don't have experience with that. I've never cut mine back because I always like mine to, you know, have as much growing as possible. Maybe I should go out and cut one off and see if I turn it into a monster spreader. Usually you don't have to get daylilies, just not too hard to get them to really spread. They'll take over the world if you got good growing conditions. So, I don't know. Has anybody done that? Has anyone cut it off and noticed that the plant just explodes on you? There are certain weeds that do that. If you whack it off, it comes back tenfold. I'm not aware of daylilies doing that, but I'm not going to hold firm to that.
So when you plant, if you have 100 daylilies, do you buy like just one of the species and one of that one, or do you put like multiple of each one?
Okay, if you can hear the question, she's asking me, how do I approach the buying of daylilies? You know, when I first started, and I'm going to relate this to irises, I used to, you know, have this design principle that, oh, you don't just buy one, you got to have three, you know, for good balance. So I used to buy three, and then I caught on that irises spread. So instead of, you know, spending my money on one, I could spend my money on three on that. So my personal thing is I'm willing to wait for them to spread. And so when I buy them one per cultivar and plant them. That's just how I do it. Other people might buy, you know, they want to start out with a more stronger planting or a mass planting, and they might buy several of one, just get a really big floral display right away. The way I do it, you have to wait. And so if you're willing to wait, you can, you know, in a few years have lots of beauty, but you have to wait. That's the drawback.
I have a question. How often do you divide them? I mean, how big does the clump get before you divide?
Okay, the question is how often you divide. Now again, you can divide them when obviously there's two plants. If you wanted to, you could dig it up and divide it, you know, one. But the reality is when you divide them, the decision is because it's outgrown its space or it, you know, is moving into another area where you don't want it and you need to reduce its size. So I would say if you have good growing conditions, probably every 3 to 5 years, you could dig the clump up and divide it.
Do the flowers get smaller if you don't divide them, or less productive?
The question is if you don't divide them, can the flowers get less productive? There are conditions where they can if they're in a compacted growing conditions where the roots are compacted, and then there are others that if they're just, you know, have good growing conditions, you just have this massive wall of flowers. So I can't give you a solid answer on that. There are conditions that they seem to, you know, flower less, and that would be a good reason to divide them at that point.
I don't remember you talking about the depth to plant them. Like if you go too deep, do you get less bloom as you do?
Okay, question about depth. This is a plant, as I said, that has a crown. So there's a distinct zone between where the roots are and where the upper part of the plant is. It's like a change in color that's very distinct. And that should be right at soil grade. So, you know, when we talk about plants like strawberries, that has a crown as well. Raspberries have a crown. Again, you want the roots to be underground, but you do not want the crown of the plant buried. So at no time should that crown ever be buried. It should be right at soil grade. Okay. Let's see. Do you know anything on the history of ditch lilies that were brought over from Europe? Outside the slide that I gave you, that's the knowledge that I have, not in any detail, other than that they did come over from Asia. Now, if there are some brought over from Europe, I don't know about those. So if you're asking about Europe, I don't. I'm sorry.
Oh. Can you plant them in containers?
You can. One of the issues with containers is like many perennials, they need to have a chilling requirement to have good bloom the following year. So if you keep them in containers, you have two things that you need to do. You need to make sure that when winter comes on, if you're keeping them outside, you need to somehow moderate how fast they freeze down. And so that means you either need to sink the container in the ground so that the surrounding ground kind of acts like an insulator and slows down that freezing process. Because if it's kept in a container, containers freeze a lot quicker than the ground does. And that could actually injure your daylily in the pot. So the larger the pot, the more likelihood you're going to be successful. If you have it in a little pot, you really need to do something to make sure that pot doesn't freeze too fast. That's what will kill it. The other thing is that, you think, well, okay, I'll just bring it inside for the winter. But they actually do need to have some chilling requirement for them to have good bloom the next year. So you kind of, if you have like an unheated garage or a shed or something like that, that might be an option as well. The chilling temperatures, and I don't know how many hours they need to have, but usually we have plenty of cold through our winter throughout the state. But usually chilling temperatures start, around that below 45 degrees. So over winter, they need to be exposed to cool temperatures, cold temperatures, for them to have good blooms. But yes, you can have them in a pot, but if you want to keep them as a perennial, you have to, give them a little special care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Do we have any other questions? Is there any that I missed on that? I'm looking back through. I think that I have, other than Sarah, I will send you that if you'll remind me. I think I have all the questions. Is there anything else here in the room with me or anybody out in the rest of the state? Well, I have 10 till 8. You've been a really great audience. I think I'm going to call it now. If you still have a question that you haven't asked that you want to, you should have my contact information. Feel free to contact me and I'll be glad to answer. But at this time, I think I'm going to sign off and wish you all a very happy evening.